May 1945. Okinawa. The wind screamed through the smoke. The air was thick with dust and the smell of cordite. Below the cliffs of the Maeda escarpment, men of the 77th Infantry pressed against the rocks, praying not to die. And then, through the chaos, someone began to climb. No rifle. No grenades. Only a medic's satchel and a folded Bible. His name was Desmond Doss. While others carried rifles, he carried faith. While others took cover, he walked into fire. He refused to kill, but refused even harder to let men die. Each flash of artillery lit his silhouette, small, steady, unstoppable, dragging the wounded by their belts one by one into the smoke. And that night, history would remember something impossible. The man who went to war without a weapon, and became a legend. Long before Okinawa, before the gunfire and the blood, there was a boy standing in a quiet Virginia church, staring at the words carved beneath a cross. Thou shalt not kill. Desmond Doss grew up in Lynchburg, Virginia, during the Great Depression. His family had little, but faith was everything. His father, a World War I veteran, carried his own scars, not just the ones on his hands but the ones that never healed inside. When his father came home drunk and violent, Desmond would hide under his bed, clutching his Bible and praying for peace. That was where his vow began. He swore to God that he would never hold a weapon against another man. But when the world descended into war, he couldn't stand by and do nothing. He said, "While everyone else is taking life, I'll be saving it." In April 1942, the draft notice came. Most men tried to avoid the front lines. Doss volunteered. He joined the U.S. Army not as a rifleman, but as a combat medic, a man who would walk through bullets instead of firing them. From the moment he arrived at Camp Lee, the ridicule began. His southern accent and small frame made him an easy target, but what angered the men most wasn't his faith, it was his refusal to carry a rifle. To them it felt like betrayal. "You're no soldier," one sergeant spat. "You're a coward hiding behind God." He was mocked in the barracks, beaten at night, and nearly thrown out of the army. Officers tried to court-martial him, calling him mentally unfit for duty. But Doss stood before the tribunal with quiet resolve, clutching his Bible in both hands. He told them, "My faith does not make me less of a soldier. It makes me the kind of soldier who saves life, not takes it." The court ruled in his favor. He would serve, unarmed. Assigned to the 77th Infantry Division, 307th Regiment, Doss went through training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, patching up scrapes and bruises while others practiced firing drills. When the shooting range echoed with gunfire, he stood at the edge, eyes closed, reciting the Sixth Commandment. His sergeant once asked, "What are you going to do when the bullets start flying, Doss? Pray them away?" Doss just smiled. "Something like that, Sarge." He endured every insult, every punch, every isolation, not out of pride but conviction. He didn't want to prove the others wrong. He wanted to prove that courage didn't need a trigger. And in the months that followed, those same men who mocked him would watch him do the impossible, without a weapon in his hand and without hate in his heart. The men who once mocked him had stopped talking by the time they shipped out. Doss didn't need to answer them with words. He answered them with silence and service. Through the jungles of Guam and Leyte, he had proven himself again and again, dragging men through crossfire, treating wounds under air raids, praying with the dying until dawn. By 1945, his name had spread quietly through the ranks. Not as a preacher, not as a coward, but as the medic who never left anyone behind. And then came the order, Okinawa. The last great battle before Japan itself. A small island but a graveyard waiting to happen. Commanders called it the Typhoon of Steel. Winds of artillery. Storms of gunfire. Even veterans said it felt like marching into the mouth of the earth. Desmond packed his kit the same way he always did, calm, deliberate, almost reverent. No rifle. No grenades. Only morphine syrettes, bandages, and a small Bible wrapped in cloth to keep the blood off the pages. As the troop ships rolled across the Pacific, the ocean looked calm, but the men aboard knew what waited. They'd seen pictures of the cliffs at Maeda Escarpment, 400 feet of limestone rising like a wall into the sky. And on top, the Japanese waited, dug into tunnels and caves like ghosts with guns. Doss sat alone on the deck that night, listening to the waves slap the hull. Around him, men smoked, joked, and tried to hide their fear. He opened his Bible and read softly under the red glow of the ship's night lamps. "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." He whispered a prayer he'd said 100 times before. "Lord, let me save just one more." When Okinawa's coastline came into view days later, it wasn't paradise, it was smoke and thunder. The first bombardment shook the sea itself. Shells turned palm trees into fire, and black smoke rolled over the water like storm clouds. To most men it looked like hell. To Doss it was where faith was about to be tested, and proven. April 29, 1945, Okinawa. The Maeda Escarpment stood before them like a wall of death. 400 feet of jagged limestone rising from the mud, its cliffs carved with bunkers, tunnels, and hidden gun ports. The Americans called it Hacksaw Ridge, because climbing it felt like being fed into a saw. At dawn, under the cover of naval artillery, the 77th Infantry Division began its assault. Ropes and cargo nets dangled from the cliffs, swaying in smoke and dust. Men climbed one by one, their helmets glinting in the sunlight before disappearing into the storm above. And then the ridge exploded. Japanese machine guns opened up from concealed caves, Type 96 and Type 99 light machine guns, their chatter echoing like 1,000 rattlesnakes. Mortars shrieked through the air, shattering bodies mid-climb. Flamethrowers roared. The earth itself seemed to bleed. Men who made it to the top were torn apart before they could dig in. Bodies fell faster than replacements could climb. The air reeked of cordite, mud, and human flesh. One sergeant would later write, "The ridge looked alive, like it was spitting fire." Through that chaos, Desmond Doss climbed without a rifle. He carried a stretcher instead. Every few meters, he'd drop to his knees, his medic armband streaked with dirt and blood, his hands shaking from exhaustion. He patched shrapnel wounds using torn pieces of uniform when bandages ran out. He pressed morphine syringes into arms that barely had a pulse. He whispered to every man he reached, "You're gonna be okay, hold on, buddy." When a grenade burst nearby, Doss threw himself flat, shielding a wounded man from the blast. The explosion tore his helmet off and filled his ears with ringing silence, but he kept moving. He dragged one man by the collar, another by the belt strap, crawling through mud slick with blood. Machine gun tracers sliced through the smoke, stitching the air above his head. Everywhere he looked, chaos. Men calling for medics who never answered. Corpses half buried in craters. The wounded clutching pictures of wives and children, begging not to be left behind. And still, somehow, Doss went back again and again. Not because he thought he could win, but because he refused to let another man die alone. By nightfall, the ridge was a furnace. Rain fell, mixing with smoke and ash, turning the slopes into rivers of red mud. Commanders ordered a retreat. Doss didn't move. He looked up at the ridge, now lit only by fires and tracer rounds, and said to himself, "There's still more up there." And he climbed again. When the order came to pull back, the men of the 77th scrambled for the ropes, sliding down the escarpment through fire and smoke. Those who could still move obeyed. Those who couldn't, stayed. Above them, the ridge fell silent, except for the crack of distant rifles and the low moans of the dying. The Americans assumed no one was left alive up there. But one man was. Desmond Doss stayed behind. As the sun set over Okinawa, he was completely alone, 400 feet above his own lines, surrounded by enemy soldiers hunting the wounded. He had no weapon, no backup, and no promise he'd live another hour. But in his heart, the same words kept echoing. "Lord, help me get one more." He crawled on his belly through the mud, dragging his stretcher behind him, whispering to every man he found, "You're not alone. Hold on. I'm here." Japanese snipers swept the ridge with searchlights, firing at every shadow. Doss learned to move between bursts, 15 seconds at a time, counting each breath. When he reached a soldier, he'd check for a pulse with trembling fingers, patch what he could, and haul the man toward the cliff's edge. There, using a rope sling he tied himself, a double bowline knot anchored to a tree stump, he began lowering the wounded one by one down the cliff. It took every ounce of strength just to keep the line steady. His hands split open, skin torn by friction and grit. Blood mixed with rope fibers until it was hard to tell where man ended and mission began. Down below, soldiers on the ground couldn't understand what they were seeing, bodies slowly descending from the darkness, one after another. At first, they thought it was a trick. Then someone shouted, "It's Doss. He's sending them down." Each time he lowered a man, he whispered the same prayer. "Please, Lord, help me get one more." Then he turned back toward the ridge and climbed into the gunfire again. All through the night, he worked alone. When machine guns swept the ridge, he lay flat until the bursts passed, then crawled again. When grenades shook the earth, he shielded the wounded with his body. He ran out of morphine, out of bandages, out of light. But not out of faith. By dawn, he had saved dozens. By morning, the number reached 75. Men who'd been given up for dead were alive again because one man refused to leave them behind. By the time the sun rose over Hacksaw Ridge, the battlefield had turned into a furnace. Smoke drifted low across the scarred limestone, mingling with the stench of gunpowder and death. The screams of the wounded had faded into groans, not because the pain had lessened but because their strength had. Down below, medics and riflemen stared upward, still disbelieving what one man had done through the night. They thought the ridge was empty now, cleared, silent. But then, through the smoke, someone moved. It was Desmond Doss. Still there. Still searching. He had been awake for nearly 20 hours. No food. No water. Hands blistered raw from the rope. His uniform soaked through with blood. His and everyone else's. And yet, when the next wave of Japanese soldiers surged up the ridge, Doss didn't run. He dropped flat as mortars exploded around him, fragments of rock slicing into his face. A grenade landed near a wounded man. Doss threw himself over him without thinking. The blast threw both into the air, tearing into his legs and back. His ears rang. His vision blurred. But when he came to, he saw the man still breathing. He bound the wound with the last of his torn bandages, whispered, "You're safe now," and started to crawl again. Within minutes, the counterattack intensified. The Japanese poured from their tunnels in a wave of fire and steel. Machine guns rattled, mortars whistled, grenades bounced through the dust. And in the middle of it, one unarmed medic crawled between the lines, dragging 5 men out from within 30 yards of an enemy nest. Bullets snapped past his head. Dirt exploded beside him. He didn't stop. Every movement was agony, every breath a prayer. Then, as he dragged another man toward the edge of the ridge, a shell burst nearby. Shrapnel tore through his left leg, splitting bone and muscle. He fell hard, clutching the wound, eyes darting toward his medical kit, empty. There was no one left to help him. He tore a sleeve from his uniform, wrapped the wound, and then did something unthinkable. He splinted his leg with a broken rifle stock. A weapon he would never fire became the thing that helped him stand. Bleeding, half-conscious, he began to crawl back toward the American lines. Every inch was a lifetime. Behind him, Japanese mortars fell closer and closer, kicking up showers of rock and soil. He could have let himself slip into the darkness right there. No one would have blamed him. But then, through the haze, he heard something, a cry. Another medic hit and calling out for help. Doss stopped crawling. He looked toward the sound, toward the enemy's direction, toward certain death. And then he turned around. He started crawling back into the fire. They found him half-conscious at the edge of the ridge, his leg bound with a rifle stock and his uniform soaked dark with blood. When the stretcher-bearers reached him, he waved them off and pointed to another soldier nearby, worse off, bleeding out. "Take him first," he whispered. Even then, even shattered and barely breathing, Desmond Doss was still thinking of someone else. Hours later, when the firing finally stopped, the men of the 77th Infantry Division descended the escarpment, and with them, the living proof of one man's faith. 75 wounded men alive who should have died. Some missing limbs. Some blind. All saved by a medic who had refused to carry a gun. When the story spread through the division, the disbelief turned into awe. Men who had once mocked him now stood silent when his name was mentioned. The same soldiers who had called him a coward began passing his Bible around before each patrol, asking if they could borrow the luck of Doss. And when Doss was finally evacuated to the field hospital, pale, weak, and covered in bandages, they came to see him one by one. The captain who had once threatened to court-martial him stood beside his bed, cap in hand. He didn't salute. He didn't need to. He simply said quietly, "You're one of the bravest men I've ever known." Every man in the ward that day stood a little taller. Because in Doss they had seen something they'd never expected to see in war, mercy stronger than fear. When he was flown back to the States, the story of Hacksaw Ridge followed him home. Reporters wrote of an unarmed medic who faced hell itself. Generals called it impossible. But to Doss it was simple. He said only, "I was just doing what I was supposed to do." On October 12, 1945, at the White House, President Harry S. Truman placed the Medal of Honor around Doss's neck. Truman paused for a moment before speaking, looking the frail young man in the eyes. He said, "You're the bravest man I've ever met." The president shook his hand longer than any other recipient that day. As the medal's blue ribbon settled against Doss's chest, photographers clicked, and the flashbulbs filled the room with light. But Doss just stood there, humble and quiet, as if still unsure he deserved it. His citation read, "For outstanding bravery and unflinching determination in the face of enemy fire, above and beyond the call of duty, Doss called it something else. He called it duty fulfilled. And while the war moved on, his legacy didn't fade. The men of his unit would tell their children and grandchildren about the medic who never carried a rifle, yet became their shield. They'd say that courage isn't about who can kill, but who chooses to save. Desmond Doss never went back to war. The same faith that carried him up Hacksaw Ridge carried him through the long, silent battles that came after. He spent the rest of 1945 not on a parade ground, but in a hospital bed, fighting a different enemy this time. Shrapnel still lodged in his body, a shattered arm that never fully healed, and lungs slowly collapsing from tuberculosis he'd contracted in the Pacific. He lost one lung entirely. His hearing faded. For years he was too weak to even stand for long. The man who had once carried 75 soldiers down a cliff now needed help just to walk across a room. Doctors told him he'd never recover. He spent more than 5 years moving between Army hospitals, Fort Benning, Walter Reed, and others, enduring surgeries, infections, and endless pain. But never once did he complain. When asked if he regretted his choices, Doss would smile softly and shake his head. He said, "When everyone else was taking life, I was saving it. And that felt right." There was no bitterness in his voice, only peace. He didn't keep the medal in a display case or talk about heroism. He kept it in a small box beside his Bible, the same one he'd carried through every battle. Its pages, once white, were stained brown from Okinawa mud and the blood of the men he'd saved. Faith had carried him where no weapon could. And though the cost was his health, his strength, and years of his life, he never saw it as a loss. He once told a nurse at the hospital, "I didn't go to war to be different. I went to save those who were the same as me, scared, human, and worth saving." In the years that followed, Doss lived quietly with his wife, Dorothy, in a small farmhouse in Alabama. They planted gardens, raised their son, and attended the same Seventh-day Adventist church every Sabbath. He never sought fame, never chased interviews, never tried to justify his beliefs to anyone. He had already proven them, not with words but with wounds. Even decades later, when filmmakers tried to tell his story, Doss asked for only one thing: "Don't make me out to be something I'm not. I just did what I thought was right." To him, courage had never been about medals or recognition. It had been about conviction, and the willingness to pay for it. Desmond Doss's war ended long before his story did. What began as one man's conviction on a ridge in Okinawa grew into something far larger, a redefinition of courage itself. Before Doss, the words "conscientious objector" were often spoken with scorn. To many soldiers, it meant weakness, refusal to fight. But Doss proved something that changed that forever. He proved that conviction and courage could live in the same heart. When the U.S. Army reviewed his record, they found no precedent for what he'd done. No one had ever gone into that kind of combat without a weapon, and come out having saved 75 men. His bravery forced the Army to see faith not as an obstacle, but as a strength. In 1946, new protocols were written for service members who refused to bear arms on moral or religious grounds. It was called the Doss Precedent. From that day on, the right to serve according to conscience became part of the conversation about duty itself. But Doss never saw himself as a reformer. He said, "I didn't change the Army. I just showed them what faith can do." And faith, for him, wasn't a sermon, it was a stretcher carried under fire. It was the rope on a cliff. It was the prayer whispered in the middle of chaos. "Lord, help me get one more." Today, his story echoes wherever medics run toward danger instead of away. Every soldier who carries another on their shoulders, every medic who refuses to leave the wounded behind, carries a piece of that legacy. In military academies, his name is spoken not as legend but as lesson. In churches, his story is told not as doctrine but as example. And in Lynchburg, Virginia, the town where he was born, a bronze statue stands tall. No rifle, no sword, just a man holding another man's arm, helping him to safety. Beneath it, the inscription reads, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends." At veterans' memorials, you can still see the ripple of that faith. Old soldiers stand quietly at attention, medals glinting in sunlight, saluting the memory of a medic who showed the world what bravery without hate looks like. Desmond Doss died in 2006 at the age of 87. He was buried with full military honors at the Chattanooga National Cemetery. His Medal of Honor resting on his chest, his Bible beside him. He left no monument to himself, only a question that endures long after the last shot of war faded. What kind of courage does it take to save those who would never save you? The guns fell silent. The ridge that had once burned with fire now lay quiet, just wind, birds, and the rustle of leaves over forgotten trenches. The same cliffs that had swallowed men whole were now bathed in gold from a rising sun. Somewhere beneath that soil lies the echo of a man's prayer. Lord, help me get one more. In the heart of one of the bloodiest battles in human history, Desmond Doss fought without hate, without bullets, and without compromise. He proved that courage doesn't always wear a uniform of power. Sometimes it kneels in the dirt, binding a wound. He showed the world that bravery isn't measured by how many you kill, but by how many you save. And through him, war itself confessed something it had forgotten, that humanity can survive even in hell. The men who once mocked him would tell his story until their last breath. The army that once doubted him would call him one of its greatest sons. And history, for all its noise, would never silence what he did quietly, saving lives not with strength but with conscience. Even now, the world keeps finding new ridges, not of stone but of principle, places where doing what's right means standing alone. And when those moments come, somewhere in the distance, that same whisper still echoes, help me get one more. Because heroes like Doss don't belong to the past, they belong to every generation that refuses to let compassion die. This is Shadows of Valor, where history's silence finds a voice. If you believe courage and conscience still matter, subscribe and join us. One story at a time.